Why don't you clap today?
Okay.
Yes!
That was a good one.
Awesome.
That was a solid clap.
We should reverse roles today. So everything I would normally say, you say, and everything you would normally say, I say.
That's weird because I was just thinking, would anybody notice if we switch sides on the couch at the beginning of a video?
Well, I mean, it's already going.
I know, but like in future ones.
We should do it.
And we should have this thing, the first person to notice and texts one of us, they get a prize.
All right, so that's the thing. Sometime in the next few weeks, we're going to do this. And if you text one of us, we'll give you like a $25 gift card somewhere.
Or it could be this thing where it's like every week, it's like, what's wrong about
kind of like those
setting.
pictures where you have the two pictures where it's like, like what's the difference between them?
Right.
I love that scene in The Office where they give that to Creed. It's the same exact picture.
On it, boss.
On it, boss. I already found 3 things. Awesome. Well, guys, thank you so much for tuning in. We are excited that you are in your house parties tonight. We got a good night for you. Hopefully your leaders have come prepared. It's actually really funny. So we text leaders a bunch of questions to talk about, and Stetson always hides little things in these texts.
Yeah.
Always at the very bottom, it's like, hey, and if this is the first time you're reading this, you didn't prepare.
Yep.
Be better.
Yep.
It's awesome.
Yeah.
Anyways, we're pumped about the conversation we're gonna have. Let's just go ahead and hop into slices, man.
Okay.
What do you got?
So I was looking up the times where the internet, like people left it to the internet to vote for names for things, and just the times that this went wrong.
Ooh, I wonder if you're thinking of the one that I'm thinking of.
So there's one that's really well known, and I think it was a research boat.
Yep.
Yeah.
Bodie McBoat.
Bodie McBoatface. Yeah. So the internet voted to make this like multi-million-dollar research vessel. They named it Bodie McBoatface.
Did they actually do it?
Yeah, I think they did.
Oh, that is amazing.
Greenpeace was kind of overseeing the humpback whale population, and this new humpback whale was born, and they thought it would be good. They would kind of like raise awareness for kind of the humpback whale population if they left it to the internet to name this whale, and begrudgingly they had to name it Mr. Splashy Pants. The whale Mr. Splashy Pants. There was this town, I think in the UK, where everyone in this village really wanted them to build a bridge, but instead they just bought a ferry to go back and forth across this like wide river, and they left it to the community to name it. And one of the most popular ones was named the ferry Should Have Been a Bridge. But the last one I found was the parents didn't end up naming their daughter this, but when they left it to the internet to name their daughter, the number one response was Cthulhu.
Like the Call of Cthulhu?
The mythical sea monster. Like this little girl named Cthulhu. But they ended up not naming their daughter Cthulhu.
Probably named her Becky.
Becky. What a stupid
Or
name.
Karen.
Becky's worse than Cthulhu. So, yeah. That's all
So
I got.
speaking of bridges, that's actually what my slice is about.
Oh, nice.
So I don't know, like if you've ever done much research on China, or any of you guys have. Like, China's a really big place. It's a really cool place.
I knew that.
I know. They do some weird stuff in China. They do some really weird stuff.
But
eat
bats.
bats.
Idiots.
Yes.
It wasn't a bat. Anyway.
You had to make it political, Stetson. Come on.
I'm not. Okay.
No, but one of them, like they build these like really crazy buildings and bridges and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Like to where you look at it, sometimes you're like, wow, like that's just scary.
Mm-hmm.
So they've got this one bridge, and I'll throw an image up here for you guys to see. Like it's all made of glass. And it's like something like a couple hundred meters up above this canyon.
Whoa.
And so it's for like tourists, right? So you're like supposed to walk out there, take pictures, and look through and be like, oh, this is glass. This is scary. What would happen if this thing broke?
Mm-hmm.
Well, there was a
no.
guy out on the bridge, and there was something like 150 kilometer hour mile, or I want to say miles per hour, but like 150 kilometers per hour
Yeah.
winds going on, which is really sinking fast. Like I don't know how many miles per hour that is, but it's a lot. And this guy was out on the bridge for some reason. Well, the wind was so strong that he's out there, and it caused like all the glass on the bridge to shatter.
No way.
And so like he had to like grab onto the metal framing on the side and hold. It took over like an hour for rescue workers to get out there to save him.
Oh my gosh.
In this crazy, ridiculous wind. So, moral of the story, in China, if you are ever there, do not go out on these bridges.
Wow. If it's windy.
Yeah, I feel like I would just never want to go out on the bridge anyways. Because if one can break, can't they all break?
Yeah, at this point. Now you're always wondering, like, how fragile is this glass?
Although, I saw this video once of, like, so it's also in China. They built a bridge of glass, but it had, like, this kind of hologram technology within it. And so there would be people walking on it, and unsuspectingly, like, the hologram would start to look like a crack, and like it would start to break. And so you watch people, because they set up a camera for it, just start to like run and like start to freak out and like lay on the ground.
Yeah.
And then it just all goes away, and they look like an idiot, and everyone around them is laughing.
That's awesome.
So that's cool stuff. Good job, China, on that. But the bridge that broke in the wind, terrible idea.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, hey, we have been in a series the last several weeks. Actually, it's probably about a month and a half now, called Jesus Is, where we've been taking some time to really kind of correct some inaccurate assumptions that a lot of us have about Jesus, or maybe that the world has about Jesus, so that we could develop this accurate picture of who he is and kind of live our lives according to that. It's been a fun series for me. We're going to finish it up next week. But like, I hope for you guys, as we've been in this, that it's been this thing that has actually led to some great conversations in your house parties, because all of these things that we've talked about, like, I think even if we kind of know what's true in our head, like in our heart, sometimes we start to drift towards some of these other things that maybe aren't true. And so our hope is really, man, like, we want you guys to experience life and joy and freedom and peace, and we think all that stuff can only come through Jesus, and so we want that accurate picture. So we've talked about a lot so far.
Jesus is a lot of things. I don't know. Hard to pick. Honestly, I can't think of him.
He's our friend.
Yes.
He's grace.
Yep.
Yeah, a lot of good stuff.
Yeah.
Well, we got another one we're going to talk about today. But to kick it off, last week, we got a foster daughter who's living with us now.
Yeah.
And every Friday, I got to take her down to Denver to go meet with her mom. And so I was at a restaurant, because it was kind of like a couple-hour period. I'm like, I don't want to drive back here and then have to drive back down. And I was sitting at a restaurant, and I'm a pretty talkative guy. I was watching a baseball game, and I started talking to this couple who was sitting next to me. And we ended up, just talking about random stuff, and they started asking me about what I do. And I'm like, well, I'm actually a pastor. They're like, oh, we're Christians. We're just talking about needing to go back to church. Like, it was like this really great life-giving faith conversation that we were able to have.
Cool.
But it got me thinking about these other times where I've had conversations like that
Me too.
maybe haven't gone so well.
Yeah.
Where like people are like, "Oh, you're a pastor?
Yeah. See ya.
Bye." Or let me tell you everything that I think is wrong with the church. Or let me tell you all of the reasons that I don't believe and that I think you're a dumb idiot. In those types of conversations, one of the things that like people often bring up in terms of like their rejection of Christianity or just their struggles with Christianity is, these moments in life where these terrible things happen.
Right.
It could be culturally, it could be things that are happening in their own life, but they often end up asking this question, like, well, if God is real, where was he when this thing happened, right? So when that shooting happened recently in Boulder, I saw people posting, prayers for Boulder, and then obviously people would come on and comment like, oh, where was God when this shooting happened?
Right,
or
for
I
sure.
remember like 9/11, or if people lose a child or they have a loved one who takes their own life, right? Like people wrestle. We go like, where is God in the midst of this? You ever heard somebody ask that? Or maybe you've even asked that like yourself.
Oh, I have.
Right? We ask these questions like in the midst of these terrible, horrible things that are happening in life, but we also ask them in some of the more mundane things.
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't help that we can't see or hear God. So it's just a natural question to ask, like, Where are you?
When I think one of the reasons that we ask it is like, for a lot of us, if we're honest, we feel like God sometimes is kind of distant,
Mm-hmm.
right? We feel like that if he even is out there, he's certainly not here.
Yep.
Like maybe he's got more important things to do or bigger priorities, or he's just in heaven. He's kind of left us to deal with the complexities and the hardships of life on our own. Now, I know I'm not alone in feeling this. Like, I know you've just shared that you feel this. I know that many of you guys probably feel this. And the reason I bring this up is because I think, like, when we start to think this way, right? Like, we kind of get in our head, like, that God is distant or that he's not here, like, that he's gone.
Mm-hmm.
Like, it kind of starts to become this self-fulfilling prophecy,
Mm-hmm.
if you know what I mean, like to where like I think God is distant, and so then in my life I stop doing the things that I need to do to actually go after him, right? Like I don't pray, I don't read my Bible, I don't go to church because I'm like, well, God's distant, like, and the problem is like that actually only makes me feel more distant from God. It makes him feel more distant from me, and it kind of becomes this vicious cycle, and you kind of get to this place where you're like, man, like I don't know if I even want to keep following him anymore.
For sure.
But what if he's not actually distant?
That's a good question.
Right? What if all those things that we're prone to think in those moments, right? The hard moments, the more mundane moments, like what if they're actually wrong? What if he actually told us that he's not far away, but that he was actually very near to us? I don't know. So let's look at the Bible.
Good idea.
That's what we're doing each week, right?
Like a good idea.
We're not here just to speculate and share our ideas.
Sure.
We actually want to look at Scripture. And I think a really good place to kick this off is actually to talk about some of the ancient Jewish practices before we actually get to Jesus, because I think us understanding some things that happened back then are going to help us understand some things that happened with Jesus, which might help us make sense of this whole question of, is God distant or is he near?
Yeah, for sure. So, something that could give a little bit of perspective here is looking at how the ancient Jewish people kind of viewed their proximity to God. And if you see a blank, feel free to fill it in if I'm missing something here. But I think it's important to start off as the ancient Jewish people, they loved God with everything that they had. They didn't view God as this tyrannical enemy or someone to be scared of. But there were certain things about that time and place and how God chose to interact with them, such as this. So they had this temple.
And I'll put a picture up here on the screen
cool,
so
right
they
on.
can see it.
Yeah, so there's this temple that they built and to worship God. And they kind of had like these series of rectangles leading outside of the temple. And outside of like the main rectangle in Jerusalem, the biggest one, for people who had no interest in worshiping God, they stayed outside of that rectangle. So they weren't allowed to come into the temple complex. Then you come into the first rectangle, and that's where people who weren't of Jewish descent, but loved God and wanted to worship God, they could be inside that first rectangle and worship God from that courtyard. But they couldn't get any closer. The only people who could get closer were the Jewish people. So the next rectangle, that was for Jewish women who wanted to worship God. And it was from this courtyard that the Jewish women could worship God. But then there was another rectangle inside of that, and that's where the Jewish men could go to worship God and offer sacrifices. But then there was the rectangle of the temple itself. And there was a series of priests that could go in and out of this temple, but only the priests could go in and out of this temple. But then in the temple, there was this very back room. It was called the Holy of Holies, and it was blocked off by this really, really thick curtain.
The thing was like massive. It was like something like a foot and a half thick.
Yeah, which is insane. Like, think about that. Like, if the curtain itself was this thick, and it was massive, and it was wide, and it was tall, and that's where the Jewish people supposedly believed that God dwelled, was behind that curtain. That's where God hung out. And there was only one priest, the high priest, who could go back there, and he could only go back there one day a year. So the only time anyone could be that close to God was one day of the year, and it was one person on behalf of everybody there. So if I grew up in that culture, to me, it would feel like that there was a bit of a distance between me and God.
Yeah, and for the Jewish people, like this distance, like it was all because of sin in their mind, right? Like so when the priest went back there, like he actually went back to offer a sacrifice. It was on the Day of Atonement to deal with all the sins of the people that had happened over the last 365 years.
Yep.
And the thing that's always fascinated me is actually like that curtain, right? Because this curtain, it was this thing that symbolically separated God, who was holy, from everybody else who is considered not holy, right? And this whole system, right? You know, this whole temple complex, like I've got to imagine that it probably made some people in that time feel like God was distant.
Sure.
You know what I mean? Where it's like, all right, we've got our world we live in, like we want to worship him, we love him, like we get all that stuff, but like there's still this barrier, there's still this thing that's separating us from him, right? There is still this distance, right? So that's kind of the backdrop of just the entire religious system that existed up to the day that Jesus came. All right, so I want to talk to you guys about the crucifixion now. And if you don't know what the crucifixion is, this is actually kind of like at the heart of the gospel story, right? You can read about it like in all the gospels, but what we know is that Jesus was actually sent here by his Father to come to earth, to live, to teach, and that was all good stuff. But ultimately, like kind of like the coup de grace was this thing that was going to happen when Jesus was going to go to the cross to die, right? To be that sacrifice, right? Like, so the priest, the high priest, he used to offer the sacrifice once a year to deal with all the sins of people. Jesus is coming to offer a sacrifice one time to deal with the sins of all people, and not just for a year. Like, we're talking about for all time, right? And like, it's this beautiful, this amazing story of him doing this thing that we couldn't do. Now, in this whole crucifixion story, there's this detail that I think is like incredibly important. Most people overlook it. It's just like this, it's almost like this little footnote in the gospel story. But I think for this thing we're talking about today about is God distant or is God near? It's like, oh my gosh, like this thing communicates so much. What the gospel authors tell us is that when Jesus was up on the cross, he's hanging there, right? He does this whole thing. And the moment that he died, it tells us that curtain in the temple,
which again is like a foot thick,
a foot and a half thick, like try to grab your sweater and tear it with your hand, like you're not going to be able to do it. Right? Like,
picture all these kids just tearing their clothes apart right now.
What it tells us is that the moment that Jesus died, from the top to the bottom, this curtain, it was torn in two. And then it just fell to the ground. Right? This thing that had always, since the temple had been built, separated the presence of a holy God from this sinful, broken people. This thing that had kept God distant, it was destroyed. Right? And that's huge, because it's like the gospel authors were trying to communicate to us that this barrier that once existed, this distance that once was there, it's gone. God is no longer this distant God who has to be kept separate from us because of what Jesus did. He is now this present God who is here in the midst of his people. Right? Like, oh. I mean, think about like last week, we talked about this idea that like Jesus isn't mad at us.
Right.
He's not this angry God who hates us. He is this God who loves us. And this thing that we're talking about tonight, like this message of him being here, like this is like one of the central core truths of the gospel. Like he's not interested in like these religious systems or like our performance. Like he wants to be present with his people. And in fact, like that's one of the last things that Jesus said to his people, to his disciples after he left. Like, can you pull up Matthew 28:20?
Yes.
Or this is huge.
Matthew 28:20. And he said, "And behold, I am with you always to the end of the age."
I'm with you always. right? So I'm not distant. I'm not paying attention to you. I'm not gone. I'm not angry. I'm not any of this stuff. Like,
Right.
I am with you.
Yeah.
Guys, let me ask you, how would knowing this change the way that you respond to some of the things that happen in your life? Right? Like, literally, like Jesus is saying, I'm with you. Like, I'm near to you. I'm here. I'm present. How would having that actually in your mind and in your heart, like, how could that change the way you handle things?
Yeah. And I think that's so important. I want to go back to something that you said about like the self-fulfilling prophecy of when it feels like God or Jesus is distant. It's like, well, he's so far away, I'm not going to go chasing after him. But you just said that Jesus is here.
Yep.
So if Jesus is right here, why would we need to go chasing after him? And
Exactly.
So it's like this paradox, like, well, how can he be here and feel distant at the same time? And here's how I've always thought about it. By popular demand, I'm bringing back the janky bush.
Yes.
And I put googly eyes on him. All right, so
Where'd you get googly eyes?
I don't know. You just find them places. There we go. You gotta get okay. All right. So how can Jesus feel distant and be here at the same time? Well, if this is Jesus and if this is me, a lot of the times it's not that he's like far away. It's just that I've lost sight of him. And from these googly eyes perspective, like Jesus is nowhere to be seen. So he must be on the other side of that room, but he's right here. When all I need to do is turn around but if I like start wandering in this direction, like Jesus is still right there, even though I can't see him. And in that scenario you talked about, it's like, well, Jesus isn't here. I need to start chasing after him. I need to pray more. I need to worship more. I need to do these things, and then maybe I'll find him and come back to me. A lot of the times when we try to chase after Jesus, who's right there with us, we're in a way heading in the wrong direction, because it's like, I'm chasing Jesus and Jesus is actually chasing us.
Yeah.
When all we really need to do is just turn around and we find that he's there the whole time.
Yeah.
And the different ways that like people go about doing this, like there's a lot of great ways to do this, but one of the things that I try to do is like, if he's feeling distant or if I'm feeling anxious or worried or afraid about something, what I've been doing lately is I've just been like trying to like relax, and I just kind of slow my breathing down. And there's this bench in Canada that I spent a lot of time talking to God about a lot of things. And I picture myself sitting on that bench again with Jesus sitting next to me. We don't talk about anything, we don't do anything, but it's just like getting back to this place where it's like realizing it's like, okay, Jesus is right here. And that's like, that's so essential. All the things that we've talked about to this point, the fact that Jesus is here, it proves that all those other things are true.
Yeah. Yeah, and I love just that imagery you used right there, right? Because what we talked about at the beginning of us chasing after Jesus, that's what happens when you think he's distant.
Right.
That's what happens when you think that you've got to go and find him. But when we realize, like, no, he is here, he is in the midst of us, that's when we, we don't need to perform or to do anything. We actually get to a place where we can just rest.
Yeah.
And we can be.
Yeah.
And man, when we see that Jesus is here in the good and the bad and the in-between, it changes the way that we respond to things. There's this guy, Horatio Spafford. I don't know if you know who he was. He lived back in like the 1800s, something like that. Might have been early 1900s. I think it was actually the 1800s. But he and his family, he had 5 kids, young infant, and then 4 daughters. So kind of like me. Very well-off guy living in Chicago. And then things started to change for him. His young son got sick and died, and it was terrible. And then the Great Chicago Fire happened. It destroyed all of his businesses because he was in real estate. And so he lost everything. And they decided like, hey, we need to get away from Chicago for a while. And the family was planning to go on a holiday over to Europe. And so back then, no planes, they were going to sail there. And so he sends his wife and his 4 daughters ahead. And he's like, hey, I'm going to meet you guys there next week. I got to do some business here. A couple days later, he gets a telegraph from his wife telling him that she is the lone survivor of their family from a shipwreck that happened at sea.
Man.
His 4 daughters died. And so he immediately gets on a boat and he begins to sail. And when they get to the place the accident happened, the captain of the ship says, hey, this is where it happened. And he sat down and he wrote something that has actually become one of the most famous hymns in the church. He wrote this, you'd probably recognize this. He says, when peace like a river attendeth my way, when sorrows like sea billows roll, whatever my lot thou hast taught me to say, it is well with my soul. Man, this is the kind of thing that somebody in that situation can write only when they know and experience Jesus with them.
Yep.
Right? Like you can't make that up. You can't fake that. Here's a guy in the midst of the deepest loss anybody can imagine. All 5 kids, all of his money. And yet because Jesus was with him, he wasn't in this place where he felt hopeless. Like he felt pain, absolutely. But he also felt the loving and comforting embrace of Jesus.
Yeah.
Like, man, knowing that Jesus is near, it changes you. It changes your response. Like for you, that thing that you're walking through right now, how would knowing Jesus is near and with you in that change the way you think about it?
Yeah.
How would it change the way you feel? Like knowing you're not actually alone, knowing that like he's there to carry you through it, what would that do?
Yeah. And by no means are we saying if you're going through something hard, knowing Jesus is there just erases the problem altogether. It's still really difficult, I'm sure, and it's still important to have friends and family around you if you're going through something really tough. But knowing that Jesus is there, it just reminds us is like, in the end, everything's going to be all right.
Yeah, like I've talked to so many people who've just had to walk through horrendous things like losing kids or spouses, and you know the Bible often talks about like this thing called like a peace beyond understanding. And I cannot tell you how many people I have seen who have experienced that, where I look at them and I'm like, dude, if this happened to me, I would be a wreck. But that's what Jesus does. It's not this, you know, oh, everything's okay because I put a little Jesus Band-Aid on it. It's like, no, it hurts, but like I'm able to take the next step in the midst of it. Or it's confusing, but I'm still able to walk forward because like I know I'm not alone. I know that he's guiding me. And that same thing that Horatio experienced, that I've experienced, that you've experienced before, like friends, you guys can experience that as well. And so Stetson, let's close it out. Let's give them a big idea, something just to maybe lock this concept in, and then we're going to hand it off to house party leaders to lead some discussion. But what's the one thing we want them to remember?
Jesus is here.
He's here. He's present. He's with you. All right, guys, we're going to hand it off to you. Hope you guys have some good discussion, and we'll see you guys next week.